Today on this episode of Plumes of Oz, we're going to look at the Budgerigar and the reasons why it flocks. Budgerigar is a favourite and a beautiful pet. When you see them flying in flock formation, you may wish your bird was out in the wild. Now, for those of you with caged budgies, I can't emphasise enough, the natural colour of a budgie is a green body with a yellow head, and on the lower part of the cheek there is a purple cheek patch. And when these birds fly in flock formation, it is the green and gold that really catches the light. A tree with bare limbs, and on most of the limbs, particularly up towards the top, the birds settle. Budgerigars. The birds aren't separated by distance, often alighting on the branch in close proximity. In contrast to the close relatives, the cockatoos, for these larger birds, when they alight on a perch, are separated by a good distance to allow for opening and closing of their larger wings. But the budgie flock is always characterised by close proximity. The budgies are a magic little bird, and today we want to look at the flocks as they form and break down. Firstly, let us look at a typical pair of budgies when they are in breeding mode, separated from the flock. The bird on the left-hand side is a male. The reason for this is that the cere, or that small fleshy-looking area above the bill, has a bluish coloration, whereas the female has a fleshy fawn coloration to the cere. Now, when budgies are in breeding mode, this is the typical situation. They may be small groups, but never large. And the male and the female can usually be found sitting together on a branch. They nest in limb hollows, and once a suitable nesting site has been found, they will copulate and then lay the eggs in the hollow, raising the subsequent young. The adult male will bring food to the female as she sits on the eggs. 3 weeks later, the eggs hatch. Then a further 3 weeks later, the birds are fledged. The fledglings have short tails, but these quickly grow. The other identifying feature is that the forehead of the bird will have stripes over it, and as it becomes a mature bird, these stripes will disappear and the forehead will become yellow. Look at the forehead and the eye of this chick as it comes to the entrance of the nest to be fed by the adult male. A young bird with forehead banding, perched above the water, and the adult comes in to supervise the drinking. The juvenile bird has a small bluish tinge to the cere, telling us that it is a male. The adult above is a female. Budgies belong to the avian order Cetaciformes, and their genus name Melopsittacus, in other words melodious parrot, and species name Undulatus, for the undulating way that these birds fly. Both in flight and whilst roosting, the budgerigar comes together, forming flocks. The question is, why do they form flocks? For during the breeding season they are often in pairs. And in this breeding mode, with the female sitting at the nest, there is only one bird out foraging, so the foraging bird density is reduced. And the most obvious factor why the flocks disrupt at breeding season is the availability of nesting sites. So a huge flock with 1,000 birds scatters as they come into breeding season, the pairs separating in search for nesting hollows. Here in New South Wales, the breeding season is over. It is autumn and the budgies come together, foraging for ground seed. And the mass number of birds make finding seed so much easier, and food is the main reason why the budgies flock. Flocks of budgies are easy to see, and when one flock sees another flock go to ground, a second flock may move into the same area and join them. I would refer to this as group or flock intelligence. So feeding here, there are 2 flocks separated by approximately 5 metres, but then they can all fly off together, chattering and sharing thoughts on what they have found at that site. So the first reason for flocking for budgies is the necessity of finding food. Budgies, as dry seed eaters, need frequent intake of water to break down the epicarp of the seed. So after eating the dry seed, they will go as a flock and search for water. On average, it takes a budgie 2 seconds to have a drink. But then, with a flock, of maybe 50 birds, it will take 2 seconds for them to land, and by the time the last one has landed, the first one of the flock has had a drink and it is already taking off. So at water points you have this impression of the flock moving in and out.
Outside of the breeding season, budgies are in flock mode, and in this state they are a very cohesive group, whether feeding, eating or in flight. Here a typical group of budgies, overlooking a grassy area where there is seed at their vantage point. They perch close together. Now most cetaceforms do have a close proximity relationship with the flock, but the budgies are the closest. Then the cockatiels are also a close proximity bird. All cetaceforms feeding and drinking hesitate at a staging point before flying down to the ground to drink or feed, and as the wind blows this branch, the budgies look at the grass seed below. On the ground, the budgies not only eat grass seed, but also herbaceous plants. Another staging point where the budgies perch, looking down at the grass. They hesitate at these staging points, always watching out for predators. The budgies maintain close proximity even in flight. The major separation between the birds happens when they turn, for here the slight reflex lag effect of tangential motion is accentuated. Another staging point for the budgies. Here on top of a barrier fence they are perched on the wire, waiting to go to ground to feed. If you have seen the zebra finches of the floodplains, you will remember this sight, and just like the finches were attracted to the seed below the fence, the same applied to the budgies. The wind blows the seed head onto the barrier fence, and the seed falls out at the bottom of the fence. This autumnal grass that we're looking at here in western New South Wales is umbrella grass. And as the seed heads blow along this fence, they hit the barrier mesh, the seed drops out, a winnowing effect, and the seed at the bottom of the fence is a good feed for the seed-eating birds. And as mentioned, if one flock flies in, so another may follow, and the budgies know that the finches are seed-eaters and follow the finches onto the ground. The wind is blowing. The empty grass heads keep getting blown along the fence, and as the budgies and finches go to the bottom of the fence to find the seed heads cover them like a cloud blowing along.
Now normally the budgie would stay on the ground for a while feeding, a little longer than the 2 seconds that they take to drink. But with the seed heads blowing around them, they are easily disturbed, and it doesn't take long for them to lift up off the ground into flight. And as the birds pick up into the air, you can see that the birds from both sides of the fence come together. Then they will return to the same feeding site. The wind and the blowing seed heads makes the budgies apprehensive and very flighty. With this heavy wind and the seed heads blowing about, the budgies are far more flighty. Now this is in western New South Wales, where the flocks are large, but not as large as further up north. But just watch the flocks. Some of them just fly by and others merge. "300 birds, a good-sized flock of budgies for New South Wales. But then the flock breaks up. Some of the birds go to ground to feed and others fly on. So the flocks contain different dynamic groups of birds. So as the budgies move in groups between the flock, so the flock gains more group intelligence about feeding and watering sites. Here there are budgies feeding on the ground. Another flock flies by, notices them, turns around, comes back towards the fence, and then comes to the ground and joins in the feast. There are so many small flocks flying about that it's hard to say that the flocks organise themselves into a single flock. This is certainly not the case. The birds are content in smaller flocks, and the flocks fly by other flocks. But what we can say is that the greater majority of these flocks are in the search for food,
water. The other thing, of course, is what birds are good at, flight. And flight as a group is far more enjoyable than solo.
A slow motion flight view. Each bird doesn't fly in synchrony, they have an individual component to the flock flight formation.
Proximity of the birds in flight is only disrupted when they turn. Birds on the outer arc having to travel further, like a whiplash effect.
Let's look at budgie reflexes. The first bird leads off. The gap from the first to the second bird is 0.12 of a second.
Then as the third bird flies off, it's only a fraction of a moment later. Motion paths of bird flocks in flight has been studied extensively, particularly in Rome using the starlings. And the undulating effect of simple harmonic motion, combined with forward movement of the flock and then individual bird lag effect, with each bird trying to maintain a symmetry of motion with the bird in front, to the left and to the right, the summation being a flock path, or with the starlings a murmuring. That turns chaos of flight into balanced flock order. And as to each bird, it's a little bit like particle physics, where we can determine the position of one particle in its path of motion, but when it comes to defining the motion of massive particles, it is beyond our computing power. And so we still don't have a precise mathematical formula to map the flight of flocks. Craig Reynolds in 1986 came up with the program called BOIDS, B-O-I-D-S, an on-screen representation of flocks of birds in flight. And the parameters of flight as a group can be adjusted, but not for individual birds. And this does make a nice screen illustration. However, when you look at a flock of starlings, and I've used here the starlings in Australia, you can see that each individual bird has its own flight pattern. And using particles in Boris or even Da Vinci, the result is a nice on-screen representation that our mind will say this simulates a flock in flight, but yet is far from the reality. I believe that the fascination that we as humans have for flock flight is all about small birds with fast flapping wings that when combined as a flock can bring order out of chaos. I have never seen the murmurings of the Rome starlings, but certainly I don't believe the screen representation can simulate hundreds of thousands of birds moving as if inspired to dance to one of Mozart's themes. But the theme is an innate ability written into their DNA that we call the murmuring.
Movement of birds in flocks
Has always intrigued ornithologists studying bird behaviour. What we do know is that flocking is mostly for either food, water, migration, breeding, and finally socialisation, equivalent perhaps to the urbanisation of humans.
Some other citizens in flocks. Rosella's feeding. Galar's drinking.
There is one further point with flock formation, and this is instinctive in the birds that do form flocks, and that is predator protection within the flock. In Australia, we are getting many feral predators, but the most important predator for the budgie are the avian ones, the raptors. It is often thought that there's a false sense of security in budgies and finches and such like coming together in flocks. For with huge numbers, the raptor can just fly through the flock and grasp a bird because of the high density. Not quite. Raptors, as birds of prey, single out the bird that they want to take. So when there is a flock, the neuronal process to pick out a bird becomes overloaded. But the raptors can still be successful. So the flocks of budgies are still wary of raptors and fly off as soon as they see them, usually to a twiggy tree where there is protection. Huge flocks of corellas in the north of Australia in flight at sunset. So many that they make a cloud in the sky. They don't have the uniformity of the budgies. The budgies in flight are poetry in motion. Red cockatoos in flight. They are in flocks, multiple flocks. Some of the flocks crisscross in direction, and it is a spectacular sight. But their wings move slowly, unlike the budgies that move with speed, enchanting us, flying with finesse as a flock. Another small cetaceform is the cockatiel that also form visually alluring flocks.
Larger birds that fly in flocks with grace are like the waders that have their V formation and then a long tail.
Cranes are notorious for forming large flocks, and in flight follow one another, and it is believed that they slipstream. Slipstreaming or not, the brogger, an Australian crane, in flight makes a melodious call.
Many larger birds move in flocks, for here in a flock they can find thermals to lift them up for long distance flights, like these pelicans.
Arctic waders like these eastern curlews flying in a straight line on the Trans-Pacific route. Then, approaching the coastal wetlands of Australia, they will circle and land. Terns also flock, but here it is different. On the sandy cay in the middle of the ocean, these birds are constantly flying in and out to feed their young. The flocking here is for breeding, but as you can see, the flocking phenomena is not ordered. It is purposeful chaos. Hovering in flight, looking for the chick, and then coming down to feed it. Another example of flocking for breeding purposes is that of the egrets, and here you can see the cattle egrets with their large nests and flying in flight formation. On behalf of Plumes of Oz, thank you for watching this video on the flocking nature of the Budgerigar. We hope you've enjoyed it. If you would like to subscribe to receive notification of further videos released by the Plumes of Oz of Australian birds in the wild, hit the subscribe button and then the bell to get notifications.